has after a breakup are very much like a clinical depression in many cases. But there are individuals that can look at a breakup as a transient event that they don't interpret as going to mean so much for all aspects of their life or reshaping their view of themselves. Why? Well, we have different levels of autonomic function. And depending on where our seesaw is, if you will, some of us become extremely distraught and can't recalibrate ourselves, can't adjust ourselves down from stress to calm, or can't take ourselves from exhausted to more alert if we need to do that on our own. And so that's why tools for doing that exist. But attachment itself is about where our autonomic nervous system resides. So if I were to offer a set of tools around these topics of desire, love, and attachment, I would say, first of all, you might want to think about whether or not you fall into the secure, insecure, or other attachment styles. Second, I think it is vitally important for all of us, but certainly for people that are in relationships or seeking relationships, to be able to at least have some recognition of where our autonomic nervous system tends to reside, both in terms of when we are with somebody and when they leave. When we are apart for long periods of time, can we calm ourselves? Can we self-soothe? Or are we very much dependent on the presence of another in order to feel soothed? Now, I absolutely want to emphasize that there is nothing wrong. In fact, there's everything right with feeling great in the presence of somebody else. That is actually a hallmark of strong and quality attachments. These days, we hear the term codependent a lot. This was I believe the term was first coined by Pia Mellody, and it actually does occupy an important role in the world of trauma healing, so-called trauma bonding, topics of another episode. I actually did an episode on fear and trauma, and we will do one all about trauma bonding with an expert at some point in the future. But codependence and codependency, the term can sometimes be misinterpreted as any dependence on another isn't good. Interdependence, healthy interdependence, of course, is good. It is the hallmark of healthy child-parent relations, sibling relations, and romantic relations. But a key element of healthy interdependence is that, yes, our autonomic nervous system is adjusted by the presence of another, but that also that we can adjust our own autonomic nervous system even in the absence of that person. That if the person goes away temporarily or permanently, that we can still regulate our own autonomic nervous system, both from states of stress to states of calm, both from states of exhaustion to states of more alertness. And of course, we all need sleep to go from exhaustion to alertness. But what I'm referring to here is the ability to regulate when distraught, or regulate when fatigued or feeling depressed. And that is all about the autonomic nervous system. So as we talk about attachment styles, we talk about infant and toddler and adult attachment styles, what we are really talking about is a complex set of neural circuitries. And one of those neural circuitries, which is absolutely crucial, is this autonomic nervous system.
Halfway there.
The autonomic nervous system is one key component of desire, love, and attachment. What are the other two? And what I'm going to tell you next is largely the pioneering work of Helen Fisher, who is really an anthropologist who's become a bit of a neuroscientist and has collaborated with neuroscientists to establish brain areas and neural circuits that are associated with different aspects of attachment, love, and desire. I think the first really high-quality study of neural circuits associated with these themes was a paper published in 2005 in a very fine anatomical journal, perhaps the best neuroanatomical journal, which is the Journal of Comparative Neurology. The Journal of Comparative Neurology has been around for more than 100 years and is considered the archival location for placing
10 seconds.
Really high-quality anatomy. They have tremendously high standards. And the study that I'm referring to is entitled Romantic Love, an fMRI, meaning Functional Magnetic Resonance Imaging, study of a neural mechanism for mate choice. And Dr. Fisher is a author on this paper, as is Arthur Aaron and Lucy Brown. So all very fine researchers. And this study, as well as several other studies using magnetic resonance imaging, things like EEG, neuroanatomical tracing, et cetera, have identified a large number of brain areas that are associated with different aspects of desire, love, and attachment. And I'll just throw out a few names of those brain areas and what they control, and then I'll tell you how those anchor to the other two categories of neural circuits essential for desire, love, and attachment. So, not surprisingly, the dopamine system in the brain is associated with desire, love, and attachment, and mainly with desire, although to some extent love. Dopamine is a neurochemical sometimes associated with reward, but as some of you have heard me say before, it is mainly a molecule of motivation, craving, and pursuit. And that motivation, craving, and pursuit that relates to dopamine is not unique to attachment or love or sex or mating, etc. It is a universal generic currency in the brain for pursuing something. Food when you're hungry, a mate when you want one, to mate when you want to, warmth when you're cold, etc., etc. Okay, so it's not for one specific purpose, but the brain areas associated with dopamine involve, for instance, the ventral tegmental area, the substantia nigra, areas of that sort, the basal ganglia. You don't need to know these names, just understand that these are networks of neurons that tend to put the person, you, into a state of forward action and pursuit and craving and motivation. They are not about being quiescent, relaxed, etc. The neural circuits for quiescence and relaxation are most associated with love and attachment, not surprisingly. And there, the neurochemical serotonin and to some extent oxytocin are the predominant neurochemicals involved. And those are released from brain areas such as the raphe nucleus in the back of the brain. You may have heard that the majority of serotonin in your body is made in your gut, and indeed that's true. But I hate to break it to you, the serotonin in your gut is not responsible for your feelings of love and attachment, at least not to a high degree. That's mainly going to be the reflection of neurons in your brain that make serotonin. And there are other areas of the brain that make serotonin as well, and oxytocin as well. But they tend to be associated with the kind of warmth and calm and the soothing that we feel in the presence of another. And again, these are not strictly divided circuits. We can have dopamine and serotonin present in our brain and body at the same time to equal or different degrees. And we will return in a little bit to what happens when levels of dopamine are very high and levels of serotonin are low and vice versa and so on, including in states of neurochemically modified states, as it were, in when we talk about things like MDMA, so-called ecstasy. But in the meantime, I want to just discuss the two neural circuits that use dopamine, that use serotonin and oxytocin, and that collaborate with the autonomic nervous system to drive what we call desire, love, and attachment. And the three circuits are autonomic nervous system, we talked about that one. Then there's the nervous system components or the neural circuits for empathy, for being able to see and respond to and indeed match the emotional tone or the autonomic tone of another. And then there's the third category, and this might surprise some of you, it certainly surprised me, but the data point to the fact that the third neural circuit that's very important for establishing bonds is one associated with positive delusions. So given that the neural circuits for empathy are absolutely crucial for falling in love and maintaining stable attachments, I'd like to talk about those neural circuits and what they are. Now, often when we hear empathy, we think, oh, empathy is really about listening to and really understanding what somebody else is feeling, maybe even feeling what they're feeling. And indeed, that's the case. But what do we mean by that, right? What is it to feel what another feels? Well, what it means is that their seesaw is driving your seesaw, or your seesaw is somehow driving their seesaw, that there's a match in terms of the tilt of those seesaws. Now, it doesn't have to be an exact match, right? If someone that you really care about is very, very stressed, you could also become very stressed. That's a form of empathic matching, and there are indeed neural circuits for that. I'll describe what those neural circuits are in a moment. But sometimes the best role for us to take is actually one in which we are calm when the person that we care about or that we are romantically involved with is very, very anxious. And in a few minutes, I'll talk about how matching an emotional tone can be good or bad for the stability of a relationship, and complementarity of autonomic matching can be good or bad. In other words, sometimes it's beneficial for a relationship to go into the same state as the other. And sometimes it's more beneficial for us to not go into the same state as the other. But the important feature here is that when we talk about emotional matching or empathy or going into the same state or not going into the same state, what we're really talking about is whether or not the autonomic seesaw of one individual is driving the autonomic seesaw of the other individual. And this is a vital principle for how we fall in love and form attachments. And it's actually part of the desire and mating process.
10
itself.
seconds.
I would go so far as to say that one of the prerequisites to the propagation and expansion of our species is this notion of autonomic regulation and, to some extent, matching of autonomic nervous systems. Let me explain what I mean. Last I checked, the only way that new humans can be created is by way of sperm meeting egg, either in body or in dish, but sperm meets egg, and then typically 9 months later, we have a human baby. The process of bringing sperm to egg, right, mating behavior, sex behavior in humans, is one of autonomic regulation. And what I mean by that is the process of finding a mate, and in this case, I mean actually someone to mate with, typically, while scenarios vary, typically is one of elevated autonomic arousal, meaning increased activation of the so-called sympathetic nervous system. This is related to dopamine release, and it's related to epinephrine release. There has to be a pursuit, or at least there has to be a mobilization to arrive in the same location whereby one can mate, right? That almost always is the case. However, the sexual arousal itself is, in both males and females, is actually driven primarily by the parasympathetic arm of the autonomic nervous system. So while pursuit is one of alertness and sympathetic drive, as we say, again, sympathy is not really what's at play here. That the word sympa means together, and the activation of the autonomic nervous system toward more alert state is because of a sympathetic nervous system, meaning the co-activation together of many neurons in the brain and spinal cord. But then the actual physiological arousal state that we call sexual arousal is predominantly parasympathetically driven, okay? To be quite direct about this, if the sympathetic nervous system activation is too high, the sexual arousal response cannot happen in either males or in females. It's inhibited. However, the orgasm and ejaculation response, which, if you think about it, is required for sperm to meet egg, is sympathetic driven. And then after orgasm and ejaculation, the parasympathetic nervous system kicks back in, and there's a calming and relaxation. So the arc of mating involves sympathetic arousal, okay, not sympathy, but alertness and arousal for pursuit. Then a tilt of the seesaw, at least to some degree, for arousal of the sort that we typically hear of sexual arousal. Then at the point of orgasm and ejaculation is back to a sympathetic response. And how can I say that? How do I know that? The sympathetic nervous system, meaning neurons within the sympathetic arm of the autonomic nervous system, are what drive ejaculation and orgasm. And then afterward, there's a return to increased parasympathetic activation. And we don't know for sure why that happens, but it's thought that in species that pair bond, humans generally pair bond, not always, the return to more parasympathetic activation after orgasm and ejaculation is thought to increase the exchange of pheromonal odors, and to increase pillow talk and pair bonding of different kinds. Okay, so that's the seesaw going back and forth is actually built into the process by which our entire species propagates. So in some ways, every human is required to navigate that process if they want their offspring to persist. And of course, nowadays, there are technologies like in vitro fertilization and intrauterine insemination. There are a variety of ways that technology has allowed people to circumvent the actual physical mating process in the way that I described. But by and large, that's the way it's done, and certainly that's the way it was done historically for, if not tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of years. That process is also what happens in all mammalian species that mate. Okay, so I'm overlooking an entire literature of animal studies. The classic studies of this were done by two individuals. I'll just briefly mention them in case you want to look at the literature. There's a guy at the Rockefeller University named Donald Pfaff, Pfaff, who has done beautiful studies identifying the neural circuitry of what's called the lordosis response. Unlike in humans, the mating behavior of animals is rather stereotyped in terms of the positions that they occupy, and the lordosis response is a kind of a U-shaping or a bending up of the hindquarters of typically of rodents, but of other animals as well. The male mounting is almost always from behind, except in some species of primates. And that lordosis response is only going to occur during particular phases of the estrus cycle. The estrus cycle is sort of the analog to the menstrual cycle, but it's not 28 days, it's 4 days or some other duration in other animals, depending on the animal. The lordosis response is strongly regulated by odors, by contact, and is estrogen and testosterone controlled. And then the male portion of the mating sequence in animals, the mounting and thrusting and ejaculation, as they're called, or mounting, thrusting, intromission, and ejaculation. Those are the four scientific categories that have been described. That's present in rodents and also in dogs, where it was primarily studied by Frank Beach, who was at University of California, Berkeley for a long time. And the entire literature around the neural circuitry for sexual and mating behavior in animals largely stemmed
10 seconds
from the work of Donald Pfaff and Frank Beach and their scientific offspring, not their actual offspring. You can look at that literature if you like. There have been human neuroimaging studies of the process that I described a few minutes ago, believe it or not, of people in brain scanners, not necessarily mating with other people, but going through that arc of arousal, sympathetic activation during orgasm or ejaculation, and then the post-ejaculatory or orgasmic phase in both men and women. And the brain areas associated with those have all been mapped out now. The spinal cord areas that control things like erection, vaginal lubrication, ejaculation, and orgasm, those have also been mapped out. And this has all been explored from the perspective of both basic science, just to get an understanding of how our species has sexual interactions and reproduces, but also from the perspective of, for instance, trying to repair sexual function after spinal cord injury, which is, a prominent concern for a lot of people, depending on where they have their injury, but in the number of people that have spinal cord injuries. So this is both vital biological and clinical data. The neural circuits for everything that I just described reside in the autonomic nervous system and are coordinated with the neural circuits that are associated with empathy. The neural circuits for empathy, again, there are many, but mainly two structures that you should know about. The prefrontal cortex, which is how we perceive things outside of us and make decisions on the basis of those perceptions, how we organize those decisions. And an area of the brain called the insula, I-N-S-U-L-A. The insula is a really interesting brain area that allows us to interocept, to pay attention to what's going on inside our body, and to split some of our attention to exterocept. And the mating dance, whether or not it's
10 seconds.
The dinner and date portion of the mating dance, or the actual physical dance part of the mating dance, or actual mating and sexual behavior, kissing or otherwise, that is a coordinated activity of two bodies. Typically it's two. I realize sometimes it's more, sometimes it's only one, but typically it's two bodies, at least in the framework we're using here. That coordinated dance is one in which the autonomic nervous system of one individual in general is coordinating with the autonomic nervous system of the other individual, and the insula is essentially splitting one's attention between how we feel ourselves, how our body feels, what we're thinking, with the thinking and the bodily sensations of the other. And that can be communicated obviously through words. It can be communicated through sounds. It can be communicated through touch, and it can be communicated through a number of kind of more subtle cues, like pupil size, or whether or not, certainly in cases where we recognize the person and we kind of know their responses, their autonomic responses under different conditions, we can assess, is the person comfortable? Are they uncomfortable? Are they more focused on me or on themselves? This is the coordinated silent dance that, if we look at in neurobiological terms, we can really see is all about the autonomic nervous system. Whether or not it's time to tip the seesaw to one side or the other, depending on whether or not the other person's seesaw is tilted higher or lower than the other. Okay, so we have the autonomic nervous system, and then we have this thing that we're calling empathy, which is really about autonomic matching. And again, the insula and the prefrontal cortex are neural circuits that are crucial for autonomic matching because they allow us to say what's out there and do I want to match to it or not. Okay. And then the third category of neural circuit that Helen Fisher and others have found to be important for desire, love, and attachment is the neural circuit associated with self-delusion. What do we mean by that? Well, first of all, self-delusion implies a kind of cynicism about love and attachment. And I think it was George Bernard Shaw that said, love is really about overestimating the differences between individuals. Actually, when I hear that, and as I say it, I really don't like that quote. I have no bone to pick with George Bernard Shaw, but what it suggests, and I think what he meant, was that, in love and attachment, we tend to put so much value in the other that we forget that many of the processes that are going on in our brain and body actually could be evoked by many other people too. But I think it somewhat overlooks the enormous power of attachment and the ways in which somebody's smell, somebody's voice, somebody's everything, or somebody's particular thing or things can really become so vital for our autonomic nervous system to feel soothed and to feel elated, etc. So I think that while the quote is accurate in the one sense, I think it does overlook the neural circuits for attachment and just how deeply wired those can become for us. So I will balance that quote with an enormous number of other quotes that I won't mention, but that you can find out there that really point to, how incredible the person is that one tends to be attached to, that there's really only one or several of people that could ever exist that could evoke those feelings from us. And of course, you can read your, Neruda poetry, and you can find these things all over the place in music and poetry and writing. So for every cynical quote about these neural circuits being generic and could be activated by anybody, I think you'll find an ample number of opposing quotes that these neural circuits can only be activated by that special someone or that particular person, or maybe in just a small set of those people.
10 seconds.
So what of delusion? Well, the work of Helen Fisher and others has really pointed to the fact that desire, love, and attachment are three separate phases of what we call romantic relationships. That typically, not always, but typically desire tends to come first or falls in the early phase. That the process of romantic / sexual interactions, it doesn't necessarily have to be sex itself, but certainly something that involves intimacy of some kind, right? And generally touch of some kind, eventually transitions into what we call love, which eventually transitions into what we call attachment. And I should just mention touch, because touch is a fundamental aspect of this whole process. There's an article, a research article, I should say. The title of it is Relationship-Specific Encoding of Social Touch in Somatosensory and Insular Cortices. Cortices being cortex. Cortexes, plural, cortices. And again, there's our friend the insula. So this is a study that explored what brain areas and what body areas are activated by specific forms of attachment and social touch. And what they found, not surprisingly, is that the areas of the brain that are associated with touch, the somatosensory areas, but more interestingly, the insula cortex are strongly activated by touch. So touch and the amount of touching and proximity and skin contact, not surprisingly, activates brain areas associated with somatosensory touch, but also the insular cortex, which again is this brain area that links the internal, our feelings about what's going on inside us and at the surface of our skin, with events external. And they found activation of a number of brain areas, the amygdala, orbitofrontal cortex, and so on and so on. That's not as essential as just understanding that the insula is the place in which we start to take our experience of our internal landscape, attach that to our perceptions of the external landscape, and then assign that a value or assign that some sort of interpretation. And positive delusion